This is Duke University.
We were really interested in figuring out what makes entrepreneurs tick, and a sort of working hypothesis was that attitudes perhaps matter. But how do you measure attitudes, right? And in particular, how do you measure attitudes like optimism, right? It's very hard to go and ask someone, are you optimistic? Because whatever answer they give you, you know, how much would you trust it?
We knew that if we looked at large-scale survey evidence, we could get measures of how risk-averse people were. And people have always thought that having a healthy appetite for risk was important for entrepreneurship. And there are a variety of theories about entrepreneurship that say that entrepreneurs enjoy the autonomy of being self-employed. And so we thought we could get some measures of that. But for a long time, we were really scratching our heads trying to figure out, how do you measure optimism? You know, how are you going to really be able to glean an optimism measure out of survey data?
What we did was we actually took the Survey of Consumer Finance, which is a very large survey sort of run by the government, which has been used by many economics papers. And we found in that there was a question which asked people, how long do you expect to live? Now, if you tell me your age, your gender, your education, whether you smoke or not, I can actually pull out the statistical life expectancy. I mean, we have the whole life insurance industry sort of built on this, saying, okay, how long should you live? And so what we do is we take the difference between the self-reported life expectancy and the statistical life expectancy as optimism, at least about your own lifespan. And then we use this, and we first ask, you know, what does it measure? And we find that if you're optimistic about how long you're going to live, turns out you're also optimistic about the economy. We looked at how do psychologists measure optimism, and they administered these psychometric tests, which we tried on some MBA students. And we found that measure relates very closely to our measure of optimism.
I'll never forget, we were sitting around the computer and we thought, oh, this is too good to be true. This is too good to be true. And we ran some initial calculations and compared it to your attitudes about whether you think economic conditions are going to improve. And everything just lined up beautifully. And so then we realized we had something that was much bigger than just about entrepreneurs per se. We had something that was a sort of a broad, a large-scale personality trait that we could use in a lot of different contexts.
So now that we got a measure of optimism that was credible, the next question was, well, does it make a difference in important choices? So, you know, what are the most important decisions we make, right? How we work, who we marry, and our financial decisions. So we look at, does optimism affect, you know, how long you work? Does it affect the choice of occupation? The answer is yes. We find, you know, conditional on being divorced, optimistic people are more likely to remarry. And we find optimism sort of relates to all kinds of financial choices.
We learned a lot of really interesting stuff, how households that are more optimistic, they save more, the head of household tends to smoke less, you're more likely to be remarried, conditional on having been divorced. It cuts across so many domains of life.
So the next question, of course, is, well, is optimism good or bad? To try and get a handle on that, we divided our optimists into people who were extreme optimists, who thought they would live to very unrealistic ages, and people who were optimistic, who thought they would outlive the life tables, but moderately so. And we find a very marked difference between these two groups. So people who are moderately optimistic, they have a long planning horizon, they think saving is a good thing, they generally take decisions you and I would think wise. But the extreme optimists, on the other hand, they end up not paying their credit card bills on time, having only a single stock in their portfolio, not having long planning horizons, and generally doing things that we would not recommend. And so we conclude optimism is like red wine. A little bit is good for you, but maybe not too much. If you were to ask people, how should companies be run? I think the answer would be, well, companies should take on, positive NPV projects. They should do what is best for the company. But does the personality of the CEO actually affect the corporate actions that are undertaken? To answer this question, John Graham, Cam Harvey, and myself, we actually did a survey of CEOs. We tried to figure out what is their attitudes to risk by giving them gambles. We asked them questions about their time preference, aversion to sort of sure losses. And one of the measures we used that sort of drew on my earlier work was trying to figure out if CEOs are optimistic. And so we administered a psychometric test. It's a LOT-R test, which has been used by many psychology papers to try and figure out if CEOs are actually optimistic, right? And so we got, by administering these surveys, we essentially got markers, if you will, of the CEO's personality. After that, what we did was we then looked at the companies, and many of these companies are not publicly traded, they're private companies, right? And we tried to see what are the corporate actions where the CEOs might have influence. And so M&A activity turns out to be one of the places where CEOs feel they have enormous amount of input. And what we found there was that if CEOs are risk-loving, they are much more likely to engage in doing acquisitions, and that too multiple acquisitions. A second sort of big corporate decision for a company is the amount of debt that it takes on. And there again, we found that CEOs who are optimistic take on more debt in their company. So this is not personal debt, right? This is on the company's balance sheet. Not only do they take on a lot more debt, they actually take on a lot more short-term debt. And so even though in theory the CEO's personality and the actions the company takes, it should be different, we actually find this linkage. One of the other things we find is, how does your personality affect your compensation? And so we find that CEOs who are risk-loving are much more likely to have a compensation package where you have more of stock options and bonuses. Whereas risk-averse people are more likely to have a flat compensation, which is sort of salary and less of the variable component, such as stocks and bonuses. This makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're trying to make a person take on more risk, right? How do you do it? We say you do it by the compensation package, but here, you're sort of fitting that to the personality of the CEO. So we tried to measure CEOs' attitudes. In particular, we measured optimism and risk aversion. And what we find is that CEOs are just much more optimistic than the lay population. And it's not a little more, it's like hugely more. They're also much more risk-loving.
What I wanted to see is if the people who were entering the managerial labor force at a much earlier point in their life also had some of those same optimistic traits. So what we did, we thought, we've got a beautiful laboratory right here at Fuqua. We've got a large cohort of highly skilled individuals who are going to go off and take on leadership roles in organizations across the world. So we thought, let's see what their personality traits look like and how this correlates with actions that they take during their time at Fuqua, and then how this in turn correlates to things that happen to them after they leave Fuqua. So we set up a survey where we measured people's optimism before they started taking classes at Fuqua. And we used the same off-the-shelf optimism test that people use in psychology. We'd ask questions like, in general, I think good things will happen to me. or if something bad can happen to me, I think it will. And you score how strongly you agree with statements like that. And that turns out to have a strong correlation with measures that Manju and I had used in earlier work, as well as it correlates with a lot of behaviors that have been documented in medical science and in other areas of science. So we use that measure and we ask, based on how you score on that optimism test, what does it look like when you start looking for a job? And we were able to measure a couple of different behaviors. One of the things that we were able to measure was the importance of your friends, the importance of grades, and the importance of getting a job per se. And one of the things that we found that was really interesting is that people who scored high on optimism tests tended to place their friends as among the most important things about their time at Fuqua, which might make you think that they weren't concerned about jobs or anything like that, and that didn't really seem to be the case. It wasn't that they weren't searching for jobs, it's just that it wasn't the primary focus of their actions. They were interested in building social networks, making friends, building connections with people. Turns out that optimists tended to search less intensively for jobs on average, but have better job search outcomes. So they got their first job offer a little bit faster than other people who were less optimistic. And they tended to get more job offers than less optimistic people. So that kind of connects to the work that Manju was doing, because she's measuring people at the very top of the labor market after they've entered a company and progressed all the way up the managerial ladder to the point where they're running the entire organization. And she's finding that these personality traits show up in their behaviors and affect corporate decisions. And what my work is showing is that those same personality traits are present when people arrive at the front end of that same managerial labor market that results in some of them being later selected as CEOs.
Your personality matters in ways that you may not even know, right? And so, if you think it's all decisions are made, purely on the basis of pros, cons, and the facts, and your personality doesn't relate with that, that's not true.
I feel a little funny saying this as a finance professor, because we tend to focus on numbers, and we tend to teach people decision rules that are very much motivated by taking a set of facts and using them to processing them and getting an answer. And if the answer looks one way, you go in one direction. If the answer looks another way, you go in a different direction. But what this research is really telling you is that the attitudes that you bring to the data have a big impact on the decisions that you ultimately take when you analyze the data.
As a parent, I ask, what are the right personality traits to have, right? And from whatever research we've done, I believe a certain amount of optimism is a good thing. And so, can you induce that? Can you fake it? Who knows? But if it is desirable, it seems to lead to, good decision making in general.
It's kind of obvious in many respects that your attitude is going to shape your behavior. But when you start thinking about what that really means for people who control large organizations, it means their decisions can have a big impact on society. And so it's through mechanisms like managing large organizations, running firms, running divisions, where one person's personality traits can have a big impact on huge resource allocations in the economy. And so you can see that at the micro level, looking at individual household decisions, and you can see it at the macro level, looking at how large corporations are run.